Well, I hope you've had a good day today. I hope everything is just fantastic in your life right now. But I know for at least some people that's not the case. I know a lot. Some people are hurting and they need our prayers, and we certainly want to be praying for you if you are the one that is struggling. So please let us know. Please let us know if we can do anything for you or how we can help you. We want to do the best that we can as God's people. Well, we are still in our study on the book of Ecclesiastes, and maybe tonight we will be able to get through chapter 3. At least that's my hope. You might remember last week we talked about Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and at the end of going back further than that, at Ecclesiastes chapter 1, what we saw was Solomon, or Solomon, if you think he's the author. We've been saying Kohelet. That's what the book identifies the speaker for the majority of the time as, besides the narrator. Who Kohelet is, maybe that's Solomon, maybe that's somebody that's portraying this sort of Solomonic persona, trying to give the appearance of Solomon, so to speak. Whoever it is, Kohelet is talking about wisdom at the end of chapter 1, but at the beginning of chapter 2, he transitions and he starts talking about, self-indulgence. He's trying to find his place in this world. He's trying to find meaning. He's trying to find purpose, and he's struggling to find any. So what he says is I'm going to dabble in all these different pleasures. Now, it's not pleasure in a good sense. We're to think of this pleasure as very sensual pleasures. He discusses the pleasure of alcohol. He discusses rather, the pleasure of wealth and what his wealth is able to do for him. He's able to build these extravagant structures. He's able to build these great irrigation systems. He has as many slaves as you could possibly think of, both male and female, and he also has their children. So he has people that are able to maintain his property, his extravagant property. But then he goes into women. He dabbled with women, trying to find pleasure. Maybe there's pleasure in love, but ultimately, he says this is vanity. Well, then he moves in chapter 2, and he talks about wisdom again and contrasts that with folly. But he says wise people are sought after in life. People praise wise people, but the question is why? Why should we uphold the wise over the foolish? His whole argument is, although people are wise and they may know what to do in certain situations, they never know the right time to do the right thing. They don't know in certain situations, is it okay to speak now rather than remaining silent? Is it okay to laugh now rather than portraying an appearance of mourning? Wise people don't have the ability to know when the right time is to do the right thing. So that basically nulls or voids their wisdom. How wise are they actually if they can't know that? Well, then he moves on to talking about work, specifically toil, and how that's also a sorrowful exploration, I guess we should say. People work so hard in this life, they dedicate their time to it, but in the end, people come along and they're able to enjoy the fruits of not their labor as an individual, but the one that worked on something previous to them. And that gets us to chapter 3. And chapter 3 in the book of Ecclesiastes ought to be a very familiar chapter, because we often read a great majority, at least verses 1 through 9, or 1 through 8, I guess I should say. Lots of times when we do scripture reading or something like that, there's a time for everything poem that's in the book that people like to think about. Well, like we said, we get to verse 1, and here's what we see. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. So notice that phrase, under heaven, and notice how that is synonymous with the phrase under the sun that is used more often in the book of Ecclesiastes. But in this case, the meaning is the same. So every activity on earth has a specific time to be executed. Now the problem is, when do we know when the right time is? Because as we've seen in chapter 2, wise people don't have that ability. They lack it. So we get to verse 2, and here's what we read. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. Now notice as we go throughout these verses, there are pairs of contrasting opposites that we're going to talk about, right? So first we start out with being born. There's a time to be born. Well, what is that contrasted with? There is a time to die. Well, okay, there's a time to plant. Well, what is that contrasted with? Well, there's a time for what you planted to finally be plucked. Now, in Hebrew, this is a figure of speech. It's called a merism, and what it is meant to do is signal completeness, like we're looking at the entire picture. We're looking at the broad scope. So, a time to die, a time to be born and a time to die, rather, I guess is what we're trying to say, is that's an all-encompassing portrayal, I guess, of the life cycle. That's how things work. We all are born, and after we are born, we are dying. For the rest of our life, we are moving closer and closer to death. Every single person faces that reality. Now, we react to that reality in different ways. Some people have found comfort in the fact that they're going to die. Some people are scared of death for, a number of reasons. Some people are scared of death because, well, they really don't know the truth, and they don't know what comes after death. They don't know if they're going to die and that's going to be it, or if there is going to be an afterlife, and how their decisions in life are going to impact their destination in the afterlife. There's that aspect of it. But then I think some people are just genuinely afraid of not so much of death, but specifically how they're going to die. People don't want to die in pain, or at least most people don't want to die in pain. So we keep going. Now, this word for pluck, we might think, well, this could be positive. You plant things with the hope of being able to reap what you sow, if we want to incorporate New Testament language into the book of Ecclesiastes, I guess, or into our discussion, I guess I should say. That ought to be a good thing. Well, no, in the context specifically of how this word is used, it is true that the word for pluck is used throughout the Old Testament sometimes in a very positive way. But here, if we let context rule, context determine the meaning of the word, this word has a very negative meaning. It's equivalent to dying. Okay. So we move to verse 3. A time to kill and a time to heal. Now, notice that this verse is a bit different than verse 2. Okay. We started with a positive in verse 2, and we moved along the cycle into the negative. We started with being born. That's a good thing, right? And then we started with death, which most people dread. So that's the negative. Well, notice that in verse 3, the negative is the opposite is presented. The negative is presented first, and the positive is presented second. There's a time to kill, negative. There's a time to heal, positive. A time to break down, negative. A time to build up, positive. Now, the word for kill here seems to refer to the intentional taking of a human life. Now, what are we to think about that? Well, just because it's an intentional taking of a human life doesn't mean morally that it is, wrong or well, the word has left me. My mind has slipped. Everybody, we get what I'm trying to say, I guess. think about it this way. You can intentionally, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's something we see throughout the Old Testament. If somebody takes your life, you take theirs. That's the eye for the eye mentality. Well, if you're going to take someone else's life, that can be in an intentional way, and you can be justified in doing that. So the question is, it's not so much about morals here, it's about the taking of a life. But then, there's this time to heal. There's this time to really value human life for what it is. Human life is precious in the sight of God, and there's a time to value human life. Now, let me say this, okay? We shouldn't read these as prescriptions. We shouldn't read these as moral prescriptions. That is to say, we shouldn't read this as the book telling us, like, this is what we should do in this life because this is what is right. Okay, we can't do that. Part of the reason I think that Ecclesiastes is so difficult to understand, and why a lot of people, I guess, don't like to talk about the book, is it's similar to the book of Job. When we talked about Job, we said that people read, Job chapter 1 and Job chapter 2, and then they'll read the portions where God speaks. And for a lot of people, that is the book of Job. Forget about the sections of dialogue between Job and the friends. Nobody reads that. Why? Well, when a lot of people come to the Bible, they want to open up the Bible and they don't want to, I got to be careful on how I say this. Some people don't want to misunderstand the Bible, obviously for good reason. But then I think some people are just lazy. I don't know how else to say that when it comes to the study of Scripture. So they just want to open up their Bible and whatever they read, they want to know that is true. They don't want to have to put in any work to determine, let's weigh this against another passage and actually see if this is how God would want us to think. Well, that's too much work, so I just want the Bible to tell me what to think. Well, in the book of Job, when you get to Job and the friends and they're having their dialogue, we're having to sift through and really figure out, is this true or is this false? Because not everything that Job says and not everything that the friend says is actually true, is actually how God would want us to think about him or the world in that matter. Or pain and suffering, I guess. Well, the same is true with Ecclesiastes, right? We have to sift through the book. Is this true or is this not? So if we read this as, as prescriptions, something for us to do, a prescriptive reading isn't healthy, okay, here in every instance. We should really read this as descriptive. Kohelet here is describing what he observes. He's on a personal quest to find purpose and meaning in this life. And like we talked about last week, this isn't some divine revelation that's coming to him. This isn't, him going and sitting down with somebody else and listening to their experience of the earth. This is firsthand experience. He's telling us what he observes, and these are the things that he observes on earth. So we keep going. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh. So now we're moving into emotions that we are very familiar with. We read in the book of Proverbs that sometimes laughing is a good thing, sometimes laughing is a bad thing. Fools laugh on their way to destruction. Laughing in that instance is not a good thing, but you know what? It is good for people to laugh. It's good for people to be joyful. Certain points in time. But there are times that warrant unpleasant emotions, and, there are times that warrant positive emotions. I think that's just what this verse is trying to teach us. But notice that a time to laugh and a time to weep it seems to be very personal in nature. Now, you might say, well, hold on just a second. How do you know that's personal in nature, as opposed to what, I guess? Well, read the next part, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Well, that seems, at least how we read about it in the Old Testament, maybe to be more of a public act. So a time to laugh and a time to weep might be very personal, and we're to think of the latter as more public in nature. People often danced when they were joyous in the Old Testament. Well, we keep reading in verse 5, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Now, this is one of the more difficult verses to interpret. in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. What in the world does this mean? What in the world are we to make of a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together? I'm not sure. If we look at the history of interpretation, maybe how early interpreters interpreted this verse, some Jewish commentators really wanted us to find a sexual reference here. Okay, so the casting of stones would mean, making love, and, so there's a time to do that, and then there's a time not to do that. And what some people have read into that is this is talking about the menstruation cycle of a woman. When she is menstruating, there's a time to gather stones. You're not going to be spending time with your wife, at least in the sense of making love. So that is a very forced interpretation. Okay, I have no doubt that when you just heard that, maybe you were like, "Oh, brother, give me a break." How can somebody read that into the text? Well, I suppose you can read just about anything into something, I guess, if you want to, but that doesn't seem to fit here, at least in my opinion. But what others have said is, the meaning here is more agricultural in nature. What we see throughout the Old Testament is, especially during times of war or times when people were going to take over a land, people would cast stones all over the enemy's land. Why? Because you're not going to be able to harvest anything. That's going to harm the soil, that's going to harm the environment, that's not going to be conducive to producing vegetation. So there's a time, to get rid of the stones, so that people can plant. But then there's a time to throw things on people's land, I guess. At least, again, not prescribing what we should do. We shouldn't read this in a prescriptive way. We should read this in a descriptive way. So, verse 6, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away. Well, here we go. We're talking about possessions. Now, this probably rings home more to us. There is a time to gather, there's a time to seek after something that you might want, but then there is a time to abandon that quest, that search. The problem is, when is the right time? Because there's a lot of people that spend so much time trying to find something, and in the end, that quest is fruitless. They ought not to have even began trying to find something because it never was there. Well, how are humans to know that? When are humans to know that this is the right time to do something or this isn't the right time to do something? Well, welcome to Kohelet's problem with the world. A time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Now, we understand this, I guess, too. When do we open our mouths and when do we keep our mouths closed? Hard to tell. When people pass away, are we to speak or are we not? Difficult to say. You have to say something, but when is the right time? You don't want to set that person off. Hard to tell. This is the problem. A time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Now notice those emotions bring about certain states. Love brings about a state of peace. Hate brings about a state of war. So this is Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We're out of time, so we won't go any further. We'll finish chapter 3 next week, definitely. I know we might have skipped some things in chapter 2, but that's okay. We needed to get on with chapter 3. But at least that's the poem that I guess everybody is familiar with. I can't wait to see everybody Sunday. God bless.